These cases began as an investigation into family child sex abuse. Law enforcement sought the DNA of Gary Siders Jr. related to the child sex abuse case. Once Siders Jr. was located, search warrants were executed to secure his DNA for genetic testing. Upon serving the search warrants for the child sex abuse case, the existence and condition of the 16 children at the Omar Street house became known. The child sex abuse cases involve intra-family relations and do not pose a risk to the general public, and I would also add, does not involve human trafficking. This case all started with diligent Dollar General clerks calling authorities with concerns over children they observed. We ask the public to be mindful of the circumstances around them, especially involving children. We continue to ask for the public's respect for the rights and privacy of the child victims in this case.
Information obtained in this investigation prompted BCI in March of 26 to open a second investigation, this one involving allegations of unlawful sexual conduct with a minor. There have been a lot of speculation and questions regarding the June 30th presence on Omar Street in Hamden. These indictments provide some insight into the ongoing.
The child sex abuse cases involve intra-family relations and do not pose a risk to the general public. That's a line from an official press statement out of Ohio. Read it twice, because the calm, procedural phrasing sits directly on top of 16 children found living in a 12 by 12 foot room. This is the crime infinity, and before we go deeper into what the records actually show, make sure you're subscribed, because we don't just cover the story, we follow the evidence. Here's what makes this case different from a standard child welfare failure. The house on Omar Street wasn't discovered because someone reported the children. It was discovered because investigators were executing a search warrant for an entirely separate case, a child sex abuse investigation that began back in December, months before anyone knew the 16 children existed. The House of Horrors wasn't the target. It was collateral discovery, uncovered in the course of pursuing something else entirely. Let's lay out the documented timeline, because in this case, the order of events matters more than any single detail.
Ohio, this House of Horrors story, one of the big questions that I've had since the beginning, that I know a lot of you have had since the beginning, is what actually led investigators to the house. Remember, we knew that they were doing a search warrant, but we didn't know why, and that is when they discovered all of the kids inside in the horrific conditions. But what actually led them there, we now have the answer. This is a story, again, that I've been covering in Vinton County, Ohio. 16 children were rescued. The kids were kept isolated in a 12 by 12 foot room, really isolated from the world, living in squalor, according to investigators. Investigators described the children, and this was always just such a sad way to describe them, but they said it at the press conference. They described them as almost feral, and said that they ranged in age from 18 months to 18 years old. The parents and the grandparents were arrested. So we've known that. But now we also know that there is a child sex abuse investigation that is ongoing that involves Gary Siders Jr. and Elizabeth Siders. And that is what led investigators to the house where they made the discovery. It turns out there are actually 3 parallel investigations happening. Investigators started out investigating allegations of child abuse in December of last year. That led to charges against 2 men. And this is interesting. These men are names that we haven't really been focused on before. But the 2 men who were charged are Josh Saunders and Brandon Henderson. And then while investigating them, investigators began looking into Elizabeth and Gary Siders. That's according to NBC4, and they say that Gary Siders Jr. and Elizabeth Siders have now both been indicted on 2 counts of sexual battery and 2 counts of unlawful conduct with a minor. We don't know who the victims of the sexual abuse are, which is pretty typical. Like, it's, you know, that kind of stuff remains secret, especially since they are minors, it seems. But officials said the victims were not the couple's children. According to NBC4, records show that Henderson, remember he's one of the new names, Brandon Henderson, one of the new guys who was arrested, that he is part of the larger Siders family. Exactly what that means, I'm not sure. It's confusing. Authorities are being very, very tight-lipped. They're just giving out really the basics of this information. which I'm going to have, again, Kim Dagonia on in a second to help us kind of piece some of this together. The Ohio Attorney General and the sheriff both released pre-recorded video statements reacting to these indictments.
In December, investigators opened a child sex abuse investigation involving two men, Josh Saunders and Brandon Henderson. Neither name had appeared in early reporting on the children found in the house. That investigation led detectives toward Gary Siders Jr., reportedly connected to Henderson through family ties the authorities have not fully explained publicly. To pursue that thread, law enforcement sought a DNA sample from Siders Jr. It was while serving that warrant, a warrant with nothing to do with living conditions or child welfare on its face, that officers found the 16 children and the state they were living in. Then, separately, in March, a second investigation opened, allegations of unlawful sexual conduct with a minor. Two Siders family members, Gary Siders Jr. and Elizabeth Siders, have since been indicted on 2 counts of sexual battery and 2 counts of unlawful conduct with a minor. Officials have stated the victims in that indictment were not the couple's own children. Who they are has not been made public. In cases involving minors, that's standard practice, not evasion. But it does mean the public record here is a partial record, and it's worth being upfront about that limit rather than filling the gap with speculation the way some coverage of this case already has.
About the Turpin case and some of the other cases that you've prosecuted and that you work on now with your firm, do you think this is just the beginning? Like, could there be other, charges, other sexual assault claims that they're looking into involving other victims?
Oh, 100%. Not just other victims, but honestly, Brian, I wouldn't be surprised if we in the future see other charges added to the complaint for their very own kids with this type of behavior. Once you see, sadly, one count that somebody's a child predator, you often see other victims having the courage to come forward. And we also see routinely, disclosure of sexual assault is a process. It takes some survivors decades and decades to come forward. So these kids are just now being rescued from the conditions in which they were living in, having issues of not being able to be fed, things like that. And so the sexual assault disclosures, if it happened to them, is going to come much later, if ever, as well as any other potential victims. So I think we're just starting to scratch the surface of what really was happening in that house, to be honest with you.
So why pursue Siders Jr.'s DNA 4 years after an alleged 2022 incident? From a forensic standpoint, there are really only 2 reasons DNA becomes relevant that far removed from the original allegation. Either investigators have a preserved biological sample from a victim that they now have the resources, technology, or legal cause to test against a suspect profile, or there's a documented medical link, such as a sexually transmitted infection, that can be forensically traced between individuals. Either path points to the same conclusion. This wasn't a cold case reopened on a hunch. Something concrete brought it back into active investigation, and that detail alone tells you the DNA request wasn't a formality.
Hi, Kim. It's nice to see you. Thank you for joining me. I wanted to talk to you when I saw that there were these additional charges filed, and it's kind of hard to sort out what's going on behind the scenes because they're being very tight-lipped with the details. But with your experience and based on what you know, what do you think is happening here?
Hey, Brian, it's good to see you again. Something is going on that's strange. And it's clear that law enforcement is wanting to not let the public know what's really happening. And what I found most interesting about this new information is, the first investigation began into this Joshua Saunders and Brandon Henderson, these 2 individuals, for rape, for sexual, deviance behavior. From that investigation came a search warrant trying to obtain Gary Siders' DNA. Why I find that interesting, and then we know from that search warrant comes the discovery of all the kids who were living in these deplorable conditions. But going back to the fact that law enforcement is actually procuring a search warrant and serving it for Gary Siders' DNA, that tells me that they expect that there is fresh evidence that will link Gary's DNA to a victim. So while all the tabloids, the information says it's from a 2022 investigation, there's only 1 of 2 ways why his DNA, in my opinion, as a sexual assault former prosecutor, would be relevant 4 years later in 2026. And that would be number one, because we have some type of bodily fluid, semen, something from a victim that we need to determine, does Gary Siders' DNA match? Or there's a victim who has, sadly, I've seen obtain like a sexually transmitted disease, and they need to test Gary's DNA to see if he's positive for it, to see if the link is there that he gave it to her from sexually abusing. But there's definitely interesting things going on behind the scenes with all of these new details coming out.
So you mentioned it. It was Josh Saunders and Brandon Henderson who were arrested and charged with child sexual abuse. And
Rape,
apparently,
essentially.
Brandon is somehow related to the Siders, like distantly, I've heard. But what would then cause them, do you think, to have to go get DNA from Gary Siders? I guess that's the part, and that's again why they blew open the whole lid about the kids living like that. But what would have caused them to go get his DNA based on those other two being investigated, do you think?
I mean, clearly they thought he was a suspect in some form, whether it was as a child predator, whether it was as an aider and abetter, whether it's as, a child sex ring, we don't know. But the fact that they're trying to obtain his DNA is very specific, and the DNA looks for very specific things, especially in sexual assault cases. We're looking for a match after we've done a rape kit, essentially. And so to me, that's what it tells us, that they went to look for his DNA.
Now to the parents and grandparents already charged in connection with the children's living conditions: 73-year-old Gary Siders, 66-year-old Christina Siders, 36-year-old Gary Siders II, and 33-year-old Elizabeth Siders.
These kids are just now being rescued from the conditions in which they were living in, having issues of not being able to be fed, things like that. And so the sexual assault disclosures, if it happened to them, is going to come much later, if ever, as well as any other potential victims. So I think we're just starting to scratch the surface of what really was happening in that house, to be honest with you.
Why do you think Elizabeth Siders would have also been indicted on 2 counts of sexual battery? I mean, what do you think that could mean?
I mean, I have seen this in my career, and it's horrible that she was working alongside him. I've seen a couple cases in my career where the husband and the wife worked together to sexually assault the children. Oftentimes I've seen the mother help hold down the child while the father could perform the sexual assault. I've seen the mother
The children range from 18 months to 18 years old, including 2 sets of twins and a set as young as 18 months. Investigators used a specific word to describe the children at the press conference: feral, not a legal term, not a term you typically hear from a podium. A word chosen, it seems, because the standard legal vocabulary for describing child neglect didn't come close to covering what was actually found inside that house. There's a documented detail in Elizabeth Siders' background worth sitting with, because it echoes a case many viewers will already know well.
Acquiesce and let her children be abused for money from other men, let them take photos. It's not uncommon to see the mom who's in a relationship with a man like this participating passively for many different reasons, right? We see her mental health issues that they're claiming, but it's not uncommon, sadly. I have seen this before in my career.
And you and I have talked about this before. I mean, her lawyer has sort of painted her out as a victim too in all of this. And you mentioned her mental health has come up. She's been trying to get a bond. Is it possible that she is also a victim, or do you think now that we see that she's been charged with this now also, it shows us even more that she's not a victim at all?
It's hard to say. There are some facts that point to the fact that Elizabeth could potentially be a victim herself in some capacity. It's interesting to me that there's reports that she married Gary Jr. when she was 15 years old and he was 18. Ironically, that was the exact same fact pattern we saw in the Turpin case. Louise was around the age of 15 and she married David when he was 18. There's a reason why 15-year-olds don't have the right to get married and bear children. They need their parents' consent or signature because they're not emotionally developed.
Records indicate she married Gary Siders Jr. when she was 15 and he was 18. That is the same age gap, the same pattern seen in the Turpin House of Horrors case in California, where Louise Turpin married David Turpin at roughly that same age difference. Two unrelated cases, separated by years and states, producing the identical marital pattern is not proof of anything on its own. But it is the kind of documented parallel that investigators, prosecutors, and forensic psychologists take seriously when building a picture of how coercive control gets established early and maintained over decades. A 15-year-old cannot legally consent to marriage without a parent's signature in most jurisdictions for exactly this reason. The law assumes, correctly, that a child that age isn't in a position to consent to a lifelong relationship with an adult. What that means for how Elizabeth Siders is ultimately charged, sentenced, or understood by a jury is a legal question that hasn't been resolved. It is, at minimum, a documented pattern worth tracking as this case moves through court. Here's the part of this story that official statements don't cover, because it isn't a legal question, it's a developmental one. In the Turpin case, medical experts described the effect of prolonged isolation on a child's brain using a simple comparison. A normal child's neural development is like a solid block of cheddar, dense, continuous, no gaps. A child raised in prolonged isolation, deprived of the everyday social and linguistic input other kids get automatically, develops more like Swiss cheese, full of gaps where developmental milestones should have formed. Those gaps, once created during a critical developmental window, often don't fully close, even with intervention.
Absolutely. In California, if a 15-year-old is having sex with an 18-year-old, that's statutory rape. That right there is a crime in and of itself. And so we see that pattern, oddly, in the Turpin case as well as in this case. And then it begs the question, if she's getting married at the age of 15 to an 18-year-old, is there some type of mind control and emotional control going on with Gary over her, and that just kind of progresses over the years that leads us to where we are now? Sure, I think that's possible.
With the kids who were rescued from the house, and again, just with your experience with the Turpins, and some of these kids apparently couldn't even speak. Do you think we're at a point now where they're able to give prosecutors information, or is that going to take more time?
Oh, no, I think it's going to take so much more time. And, we had one of the experts explain to us very eloquently when we were interviewing and trying to understand the depths of the damage to the Turpin kids and how their brain developed or did not develop because of the conditions. And one of the experts explained to me that if you take a piece of Swiss cheese, there's holes all throughout it. And then if you take a piece of cheddar cheese, there's no holes. A normal child's brain is supposed to develop like that cheddar cheese, no holes in it. But the kids who are not receiving the communication, the normal societal things that they're supposed to be experiencing, are missing out on very significant markers in their age and their brain development, which is creating these holes like the Swiss cheese. And those holes likely will not be filled in. So while we hope that there's some type of therapy and socializing and, types of things we can do with these kids to fill in the holes, there's a good chance there's going to be permanent damage that they may not be able to disclose. The hope is that they will get good treatment and will be able to, but I don't know.
With the Turpins, how long did it take for you to be able to get,
I don't think we know everything. I don't think the Turpins disclosed everything to us. I really don't. They started to build.
That's not speculation about the Ohio case specifically. It's documented outcome data from a directly comparable case, and it's very likely the same clinical framework doctors and prosecutors apply here as the children are evaluated. Authorities have been notably restrictive with information in this case, more so than in most comparable child welfare and abuse cases. Officials have stated this is deliberate, framed around protecting an ongoing investigation and preserving the privacy of child victims who are, by definition, minors. That's a legitimate legal rationale, and it's worth taking at face value rather than assuming a cover-up where none has been demonstrated. But it also means that what we don't know here may end up matching as much as what we do. The gaps in the public record aren't oversights. They're intentional, and that shapes how any of us, including this channel, should talk about the case responsibly while it's active. One documented detail stands out as the actual origin point of the entire case, and it's easy to overlook because it isn't dramatic on its face. It wasn't a tip to a hotline or a mandated report from a school counselor. According to officials, this began with retail clerks, employees at a Dollar General, who noticed something about children they observed and called it in. Not a caseworker, not a specialist trained to spot signs of neglect. Store clerks, paying attention to something that struck them as off and choosing to make a call. It's worth noting because it's a reminder that the systems built to catch cases like this one didn't catch it first. Ordinary observation did.
To like eat or something, they would their chairs would be like turned away so I wouldn't see them unless at the specific time that I'm in the kitchen standing there, they walk by, then I see them. So it was very yeah, it didn't really feel like I ever knew them.
In Ohio, there have been people from the community who have come forward and said, oh, we sort of suspected something.
Yeah.
Oh, the kids smelled weird. We would see them out sometimes. How important is it that if someone sees something out of the ordinary like that, to call the police or to take note? Yeah,
I think it's very important. You can literally save so many lives and it doesn't hurt you. Like, it honestly really bothers me when people are like, oh, I noticed something, but I never said anything. And then, because you only see a little bit of it. Imagine how much is going on. Imagine like you could literally save a life. You deciding between, do I call the police and like be wrong about it, or do I stay quiet just for like, I guess, my own comfort? That could very likely be deciding between someone's life or not.
What happens next in the children's recovery is procedurally significant, not just emotionally significant, and it's where the Turpin case offers the clearest reference point available.
I really, really appreciate Kim for taking the time to talk with me. She's just such a rock star, and as I said, she was the Turpin prosecutor. You know, remember the Turpin case, which was the original House of Horrors case in California. The Turpin children were beaten, strangled, starved by their parents, David and Louise Turpin. They were chained up. They were only allowed to bathe once a year. And, you know, it was just terrible. It was terrible. And you guys might remember within the last month, I interviewed one of the kids, one of the victims, Jalissa Turpin. And you're going to hear more from her in a second. It was her sister, Jordan, who was able to escape in 2018. She was able to call 911 from a deactivated cell phone. And that sort of broke that whole case open. There's a lot of similarities, it seems, between that case in California and the Ohio House of Horrors case. One thing that's so disturbing about the California case with the Turpins was that they were re-abused. They were put into the foster care system, obviously because they were taken away from their parents, and then they were re-abused by some of their foster parents. So that's really a concern with these Ohio kids. And I want to play for you a little more of my interview with Jalissa Turpin, who was one of the survivors, one of the Turpin kids. I did an episode with her earlier this month, but there was more of the interview that I hadn't shared yet that I want to share in this episode, just because I think she is an inspiration because she survived and overcame so much. And when we talk about this Ohio case and we learn now more about what these kids may have gone through, I think it's important to hear from Jalissa because she...
In that case, it took roughly 6 months of consistent, weekly contact between prosecutors, investigators, and the children before enough trust was built for the first disclosures to happen. And even then, prosecutors involved in that case have said publicly that full disclosure likely never came, even years later. If that timeline holds here, the public record on the Ohio case is going to move slowly, in indictments and court filings released over a period of months or years, not weeks. Viewers expecting a fast resolution should recalibrate that expectation against what's documented from the closest comparable case. There's also a documented risk specific to what happens after removal from a home like this one. In the Turpin case, several of the children were placed into the foster care system and were subsequently re-abused by foster caregivers who were later criminally charged themselves.
So again, I'm just like blown away by her strength and how much she has grown and healed, and it's really just an inspiring story, especially because, as I mentioned earlier, she wasn't just abused by her parents, but she was re-abused in almost a worse way when she went into the foster care system in California, which again is one of the reasons she wanted to do this interview, because she wants to send a message to the authorities in Ohio with these kids now in Ohio that were rescued to make sure that they have good foster parents and non-abusive foster parents. What happened to her is, again, put in a foster home, re-abused. The foster parents were Marcelino Alguin and his wife Rosa. They ended up getting charged with child abuse. And again, just to think that Jalissa and her siblings were re-victimized. But I talked to her about that.
And so it is so important for everyone to like keep a close eye on these kids from Ohio and make sure that they are getting the care, or more so like...
That's not a hypothetical concern raised for dramatic effect. It's a matter of public record in a directly comparable case. And it's a reason child welfare advocates are already raising questions about placement and oversight for the 16 children removed from the Ohio home.
Why is everybody asking how I am? Like, it was so weird because it's the most common phrase ever, but it was never used. I don't remember a single time in that house I was ever asked like by like an adult or a parent, like, are you okay, or how are you? Like, it was just odd to me, and I thought it was just because it was my case that people were like, I guess, concerned. But and I heard people talking to saying it to each other, so it was a little bit confusing. But yeah, I feel like it's easy for people to forget like common things like that. Like, it literally is like so hard to adjust. And like for these kids in Ohio, them coming out into this world when they've been isolated their whole life, it's gonna be hard. Like, as much as I wish I could be like, it won't be that hard, it'll be easy, that's not the case. It's gonna be really hard to adjust, but it's definitely possible. And it's definitely possible for them to get the healing and everything that they need. And I think that's why it's so important that we make sure their surroundings, the people around them, the workers, and like the schooling that you place them in, like, don't put it in a school that's like known for being bad or something. You know, like the foster care system, like the workers you place them with, the house foster homes that you place them with, it is so important because right now, this is basically their first, like, I don't know, because I'm not them, but for me, it literally felt like my first day on earth. And so whatever I got, that was normal to me. Like, for me, when I got out, it was a little bit intimidating, but I was so happy. Like, I was always on cloud 9 because it was like, honestly, just being able to see a tree, just being able to...
Whether the same failure repeats here is not yet documented either way. It's a specific, trackable risk, not a foregone conclusion. If you want to follow this yourself rather than take our word for it, the indictments against Gary Siders Jr. and Elizabeth Siders are filed with the relevant Ohio County Court and are part of the public docket. The joint statement from the Ohio Attorney General's office and the county sheriff is publicly archived on their respective official sites. Read the language they chose in that statement, particularly the line about this not involving the general public, and ask yourself, does that framing describe the actual scope of what happened here, or the limits of what officials are currently willing to disclose? Put your read in the comments. If this breakdown of the public record was useful, hit like, share it with someone following this case, subscribe to the Crime Infinity, and turn on notifications, because as new filings come in, we'll be back with what they actually say, and nothing more than that.